Boom. So
It doesn't echo for me in this reading group. It did in the other, but only one voice this time.
I am. It's not echoing. You said.
No,
Oh,
it really does.
Cool. I'm attempting to use things the right way here, but yeah, it's always a discussion.
Oh yeah, what's your bookstore story?
I was trying to find a way to be cooler about it than what I'm going to do, but I don't think it's going to be cooler, so I'm just going to kind of do it. I don't want to see this. My computer screen's being really funny right now, so let's go back. Okay, good. Okay. What's this guy's name?
So yeah.
This is not a very interesting thing to look at. So long story short, I was at a bookstore, a local used bookstore around here in Boston, and I'm kind of a Wiener fanboy, and they have a used section and a new section, and I was looking downstairs and in the used section, and they don't have a database for it. But I looked around, and I'm like, geez, there's probably not going to be something like that here. So I did anyway, and I came up and said, hey, what's in your directory for like Norbert Wiener stuff? And like, oh, sorry, we don't have anything. So of course I just stumble across the way and see this book title, Power and Progress. You're like, oh yeah, that looks kind of like what it's about. And the thesis is basically about how power, just because we have technological growth, doesn't mean, like, even in simple terms, doesn't mean wages are getting better necessarily. And it goes through a bunch of examples as to why and all this other stuff. But I was just flipping through the title, and there's a bunch of really interesting quotes about everything else, like from all these different like contemporary folks who comment on various things. And as you can probably tell, Norbert Wiener's mentioned, and as mentioned, I was just kind of like down, like, oh, there's not going to find anything here. And then I open up to the contents page, and the quote directly across from the contents page is from Norbert Wiener, and it's I don't know, I'll just read it. If we combine our machine potentials of factory with a valuation of human beings on which our present factory system is based, we are in for an industrial revolution of unmitigated cruelty. We must be willing to deal in facts rather than fashionable ideologies if we wish to get through this period unharmed. I think that's from the original Cybernetics book, but I'm not sure. It didn't say. But it's from 1949. And I don't think it's the best quote from Norbert Wiener, even on this topic, but it was heartwarming to see that. And he is actually mentioned later in the book too. So that's cool. And it's from a very modern vantage point about things. Although honestly, I've only read like a little bit of the first chapter so far in the introduction. But honestly, like this chapter that we read really impressed me, just because of some of the things that were covered and the way it kind of related to like just embodiment. I put in the Slack, like, wow, this is like serious embodiment stuff that's put into salient, I say, ethical terms. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. My remarkable story probably could have been told in a more fun way, but I didn't get to set it up and find some like things for it. So sorry for the letdown there. But needless to say, I'll be on camera for a little bit. I'm not trying to avoid camera, but I do think it kind of screws up my like internet stuff here. But yeah, so that's I have some other things to say, but I'll like we can do general updates. Anybody like other comments from everything else over the last 2 weeks since we've rejoined?
I don't have anything specific to this group. So.
Yeah,
Okay.
no, and we just talked last night. So
Yeah.
Yeah. But I'm still honestly a bit high from that conversation in terms of projects I want to do, like long term, short term, society ethics, tech, coaching futures, and everything else. But we don't have to get into that here. But like I'm really motivated about some things, and I really just want to like block out as much as I can to move the things forward that I want to move forward, because it's like I have the opportunity to do so now. I feel like one last thing about the book, though. I feel like the book about power and progress is essentially. I wonder if they chose a really tame quote just to kind of make Norbert Wiener more palatable or something, because it's nice. But I feel like some of the things he says, even in this chapter, is super. Like he comments on the last 400 years, somewhere in this chapter, and it's like, yeah, like it feels like the Power and Progress book is this sort of direct, like lineage from some of the views here, and more like uncomfortable vindication for some of the things that were prescribed or envisioned or feared would happen. Yeah. My only update is I'm excited to kind of be building out a little bit of a library around books like this for some JoPro related things. So that's it. With that, I'll turn it over to I think there were actually I think we were like at the very end of this last time. So maybe if we catch up the last couple pages, there was something in here I wanted to mention specifically. The Mad Hatter thing was a little confusing to me at the end of last chapter. But then this is it. I really like this paragraph. And it's kind of a famous quote for him. Like the thing you've probably heard before is a time inconvenient for own survival. But I like the whole paragraph of fail to realize that a highly special period of history in the world, the pace at which change during these years has taken place is unexampled in earlier history, as is the very nature of these changes. And it really harkens back to what I think was last Saturday that I was saying, hey, a modern day Norbert Wiener would really comment on this stuff. And well, he already did in his own time, and I'm sorry, just emphasize it even more right now. Like, yeah, this is a major thing, and like I don't think I think it's in the original cybernetics. Jeez, sorry, I think it's the original cybernetics book where he says something about like he comments on the anti-homeostatic nature of like news media being kind of fooled around with, or like misinformation. And I don't know if he gets into that here ultimately or not, but just this there's a lot in this whole paragraph, and he kind of goes an example about changing a farm, and sort of the process and how that affects the production capacity of a lot of things in an irreversible sense, sort of. But I think this whole, this paragraph is particularly, I don't know, interesting to me.
yeah, I thought that was really profound. I thought that was, I don't know, he was speaking from a vantage point that I kind of got at this last time. There's like a timelessness to it, even, and that comes from him like knowing where he is in time and the limits of that result from that. But this felt very, very like he had a perspective where I don't know. It was like he was recognizing patterns that are easier to recognize now, but also had their like they had their manifestation at that time too. Like talking about the farm, I thought was interesting because that's so that just like emphasizes the distance, like how far we've gone past these like points of no return, to sound really cynical, but just like how I don't know, this what he says about no longer being able to live in our own environment and having to modify ourselves instead. I feel like that's just that gets truer every day. And I don't know, it was like an interesting description of this like feeling of doom almost, of just like passing points of no return, and we've just like I don't know. And then he doesn't give like a way out, I guess, but
I wonder about that to some extent in the future, and in terms of like I would love to sit like face to face with Norbert and be like, so how awkward was it to be in a time period where you could see this and know that pretty much for like probably for the rest of your life you can see these consequences and know that at a society, like at a zeitgeist level, that which you can see because you have designed and worked with the technology intimately, and you know what affordances it lets you see from your viewpoint. Like, what was it like to just deal with that? And also, like, how does that relate to your ability to offer solutions? I feel like we now are both much better able to reference that which he supposed would come. Like, this is happening here, this is happening in this case, here's where the perspective that we didn't have before, made available by the technologies, is affecting us. But we're also under the gun a lot more because we have 100 years of like massive exploitation of environment and systems, and the debris and and like the pollutants affecting both like the physical embodiment and mental health and chronic diseases, but also like the environment outright, and the resource constraints that have affected that too. So it's sort of like the catch-22 of that, and like, man, like what do you the way he talks about the last few hundred years is like, man, like, yeah, and then another 100 years later we're at this point, and it's just like so I don't know.
So he does say that yet this pessimistic sentiment is only conditional upon our blindness and inactivity. I'm convinced that once we become aware of the new needs that a new environment has imposed upon us, as well as the new means of meeting these needs that are at our disposal, it may be a long time yet before our civilization and our human race perish. I guess that is like him. I don't know. I kind of forgot that he said that because I guess I'm pessimistic about getting out of this state of like blindness and inactivity, because there's forces acting against that in our society. So yes, like this sentiment is only it only applies if we don't recognize the issues for what they are. But maybe that's not true, because now it seems like all of this, it's like tyranny without a tyrant. I think that's Arendt, some philosopher said that, to describe like the forces of like just like societal forces that can persist past any like individual person's actions.
Right.
So it's like, even like we've created these systems that have lives of their own. So
right.
Maybe I'm so pessimistic that all that's needed is awareness. It's like awareness, but also resources, which are being stripped from us like more and more every day.
And I think that's what I actually like about the Power and Progress book. If there's like a follow up to this book that's a modern thing, I would say the Power and Progress book, because they kind of detail. I don't know I don't know how hard in the paint they go about saying we need to change X, Y, Z because I'm not there yet. But they explicitly say, look, the it's not going to be just let's be more productive and let's be better technologically. Like, it's funny because I feel like all Norbert can do in the situation he's in is kind of, talk the way he did. I mean, he probably could have done more certain activisty things, but he did it in his own way, I think. But it's sort of like the book Power and Progress is by two like economist people, and I was honestly wary about that because it's like, well, unless you're basically dragging your discipline and training in a constructive way of saying we can't use these economic factors the way that we have, is like, are you really going to talk about the issues the right way, in my opinion? And it seems like they are, but it's sort of like, yeah, to kind of make it a little bit more explicit, like, it's not just going to be education. There's going to have to be literal deconstruction or changing. Like, I always refer to it in my JoPro related language that I'm developing. It's like there's two tracks, and the track that we're on right now is destined towards not good things. And a lot of the inertia and tools and buildup and strategy and ideas and economies and way of valuing things are all pointed like basically off the cliff as far as I'm concerned. And it's like, you're going to have to talk about, okay, what's the other track that you're building simultaneously as we're going on this track that you can't get off of? How do you build the other track that's not headed off the cliff, and deal with the pressures of doing that? That's hopefully going to a different direction and not beholden or subordinate or dominated by the same sort of operative principles that exist. And it's like, so yeah, I don't know how hard in the paint Norbert goes in that direction. I would imagine this. I actually wanted to say this because in the next chapter, he basically says, by the way, fascism is like scientifically flawed because we're comparing ants to humans, and humans don't even make very good ants even if we wanted to, and here's why. And I was like, wow, that's pretty cool. But also, like, I wonder in the first edition of the book, like how much more unbridled is he in that commentary, and what was it? If this is for popular consumption, his ideas must be pretty, like, he probably, if I could just talk to him one, I want to be like, yeah, like, this is a.
So this is the future shock argument. I mean, it's basically, if you're familiar with Future Shock by Alvin Toffler, that book was published in 1970, so it was right around the same time. I don't know, like, what the connection is, if there is a connection, but I was trying to figure that out. But basically, the idea that like cultural change is going faster than our ability to sort of adapt to the cultural change. So culture or cultural evolution is our ability to sort of build our own environment around, things that we need to survive. So, we've been doing that for many, many thousands of years. And then, the idea is that when you go through periods of rapid technological change, cultural evolution exceeds the ability for people to sort of adapt to it, or they feel like there's some cultural loss or some sort of loss, social loss. And, just to think about what sort of the broader context of a lot of the technological change, people have, if we think about what our grandparents were doing or what our great grandparents were doing, they had very different lives than what we do now in a number of ways. And maybe not all of us, but a lot of us. And so, that's one of those things where, maybe it's a feature of cultural evolution where, when you have these periods of rapid change where you can't catch up socially, or if it's something else. And, I don't know what the answer is there, but like, I think that's something to explore to get a broader context on. It's interesting that there are two pieces of work that are kind of published around the same time. Maybe people are thinking along the same lines, or maybe there's a connection there that I don't know about. But yeah,
I'm not familiar with Future Shock. Like, when was that?
Oh, that was well, that was published in 1970.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. I do know about it,
Yeah.
but it's 1970s. Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, it's basically a similar argument with respect to like cultural evolution, and there have been a lot of it's a very popular book, so it's not like highly academic, but basically it's the argument that uh, yeah, it's a similar argument, I guess. Um, it has the typical like sort of scala natura of cultural evolution. So the idea is that we descend from some sort of you know, noble past where we didn't people didn't experience pain or whatever, and then we come to the present where it's too much technology or something, too much change in a too short a period of time. Which is, I think, the point is that you go from your social systems have a certain inertia to them, your institutions, your cultural systems have a certain inertia, but like social change or the change that actually happens when we interact and do things with new technologies. We have new things like climate change to adapt to, and we have to do those things at a certain rate, and the institutions can't keep up, or maybe people's psychological sense of like the world as a coherent thing can't keep up. I mean, it's a common theme to say that like the world is always changing, and that's always a common thing, and it always is changing. But the question is like what is the sort of the rate of change versus the inertia of institutions and the inertia of social mores and things like that. I mean, I'm just riffing at this point, but you get what I'm trying to get at here.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
it's like there's a like at any point in history, there's a feeling of maybe getting left behind, or just like the unknown of the future. Like no matter where you are in time, that exists, and that impacts like the psyche, the collective psyche. And so maybe like at all points in the past, there's been reasons for feelings of doom, and is it really worse now? And I feel like at every point in time, people want to say, yeah, it's worse now, but
Yeah.
And that can be true. It can be continually getting worse, but there's something we can learn from looking at discussions of that kind of doom feeling in the past and how things have panned out. Also, Jesse, to be really annoying, can we move those notes to the meeting page notes, the tab to the left of this one? Because I want to keep the book page just like notable passages and short like commentary.
No, it's fine. I was going to ask what you were doing about that. I'm not sure where to put it.
Because I also took some notes on the meeting page above. Thank you.
All right. Yeah. I just want to say this kind of for myself to go back and look at this later or like think about it. There's one of my first like a somewhat formative political science international relations teacher of mine way back in the day. Kind of, he would say something like, "Oh, like the hardest time," like the reference to quote. I don't know if he said it or someone else, but like the hardest time to understand in terms of a historical sense is the one we're in now. And I believe that to be true, but also I believe that to basically, I believe it's not false, but inaccurate to say that other times were easier to understand. It's just that right now, what we see in the past is the superficial materialization of the choices that were enacted, if not necessarily made, the ones that were enacted and put out into the world. And it's like, I think part of my frontier map stuff and this conversation we're talking about is like, just because we only see the results, like the starlight from far away, doesn't mean like the stars themselves that produce them weren't like chaotic and full of possibilities, and like you have to, there's a certain appreciation that's very easy to lose, and I think it's a major lacking like of the whole embodiment process of the human process of the human experience. Like it's very easy to lose that perspective of possibilities, but that's more of a conversation with myself than what we're talking about here necessarily. So do you want to lead with any of these discussion points before we start going through the book, Amanda? I know you wrote some of the stuff out here.
I just put that one screenshot because I was reading something else, and this was talking in a way that was like very loosely 4E, and I liked the wording. I also thought it was relevant to Jesse, your like articulation of this neurodivergence interest, but it's definitely a tangent, which is why it's labeled as such. But I guess we don't really have to talk about it at all. I just wanted to share the quote.
I'm interested in the 4E perspective here. So, I mean,
yeah, and
kind of guide us through that thought, maybe.
This is from a couple pages ago, so we can start. I'm fine with starting with this before we go on to the next chapter. It's from page 38, it looks like.
Oh, it's a different book.
Yeah,
it's from something else. But it's related because I like the way it talked about adaptation. That, what is it? We've reached a certain level of complexity so that we can like respond to our environment. We can select a complex kind of environment to which we respond. So I just like that articulation of this, like a higher level of organization, allowing this kind of like meta adaptation where we can choose the environment that we're adapting to. And then the bit at the end reminded me of your thoughts on the neurodivergence first personal methods stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's quite interesting, related to some of what Norbert said in this last chapter too. Did you say what book this is from here, or is this?
It's called Mind and Tissue, and it's like it's like a description of Russian social psychology and a little bit of the history of that, and it's like that interspersed with like endorsement of particular ideas. It's a little all over the place, but it's very much looking for it. It's like critical of the very non-4E-ness of Western psychology, basically. And I pulled it up because Pavlov was mentioned by Wiener, and this book talks about a lot about Pavlov. So I was seeing if there was anything interesting.
Okay, yeah. I think it's a very interesting quote too, and related to what we were talking about for sure. And there's some things, the way Norbert got into in chapter 3, the way he got into like neoteny and change, and how, I don't think he said phenotype, but like sort of this, there's an extended period of like growing and adolescence, and there's a lot more feedback incorporated into human development too. And I think there's a lot of connection between the neurodiversity project, also frankly the learning, development, and evolution theme in the lab, and this. So yeah, cool.
Yeah, I thought that the discussion of the difference between ants and humans, like politically and then physiologically, I thought that was a really illustrative. I just found his ideas very clear when explained in that way, contrasting human society with an ant colony. When it sounds very like, I don't know, trivial or like childish, but I thought it was really profound.
Yeah, I really liked it, and also like I was kind of, I'm listening a lot of times when I'm walking, and like just to go from like boom 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 boom, this like this setup and the start of the thing about like the first couple of pages were also, like you mentioned Saratoga, and I'm lived in Saratoga, so it's this weird like, hey Jesse, like like this like direct contact of, okay, we're talking about Leibniz, like yeah, then Ashby, who is like doing a really lot of good work about this stuff here, and like cybernetics and what's this amphibia? What is? Do we know what that is? I don't know what that is.
No.
A snake with two heads.
Oh, okay.
What was the passage?
It's this thing, the whole conception of organism, the creature that learns is not the mythical amphisbaena of the ancients, with a head at each end and no concern where it's going. It moves ahead from a known point into an unknown future, and this future is not interchangeable with the past.
So we talked about the Ouroboros last night. Now we have snakes doing different things, like
Various.
eating their tail, and yeah,
Just got to combine them into one symbol.
yeah.
It's not eating its tail; it's eating its other head.
Notice it was spawned from the blood that dripped from the Gorgon Medusa's head as Perseus flew over the Libyan desert with her head. That's pretty intense mythology. I kind of tip my cap to that. Which of course Norbert knows from his father making him know that growing up, I'm sure. Any rate, so it's like we're talking about this stuff, and then he kind of goes into locomotives, and then it doesn't apply to just Panama locks, but also armies of individual human beings, American Revolution, and then like Battle of like marching up from New York at Saratoga. I'm like, I was just so like in a boxing match or something where just someone just like doing stuff was like totally not expected. Like, where are we going with this? And then we go right to ants, social feedback, Eskimos. I'm like, sure. And then loosely connected communities. And like, wow, this is covering so much ground in these analogies and reference points here. I'm kind of just trying to keep my head on this here. And then where does it go? And then he goes, okay, let's take a deep dive into ants. I'm like, okay, sure. It goes explicitly into the biology of blood and development and crustaceans, and by having a big shell does this work, and it works if you're not moving very well, and
very deep embodiment.
Yeah, and that's why I wrote in here, holy talk about embodiment. Yeah. And it's just like, whoa, like Norbert just casually deeply dives into something you could recite this at like Embodied Intelligence 2023 and it'd still be like, yeah, that's relevant and like a deeply profound set of principles here as to like why that's the case, and really well articulated to me. Even like they're both air breathing forms that represent the end of a long transformation of easygoing life from the water to the land-bound ones. And it's like, yeah, you're right. Mechanical reinforcement, shells, man himself represents the direction of development. And he talks about like the cartilage and why the cartilage is important and how it affects the bone structure, and like deep embodiment, not just like superficial, but like direct physiological, biological, health, medical related stuff.
Right, because all of this is supposed to, like these bodily differences are supposed to also be manifest as mental differences. Like it's almost like the bodily description is kind of a metaphorical description for the psychological stuff. Except it's not really metaphor. It's like actually, it actually impacts the mental realm. Right. But things like the flexibility and the fluidity, it was clear that like he was also implicitly talking about like mental features as maybe emerging isn't the right word, but as resulting from the bodily features, or at least there are parallels.
I think like one of the ways I'm going to use this whole argument in the future is that I think the analogy, I think like the punchline in a lot of ways is humans would not make very good ants. Like that concept of the way, like there's very specific reasons, and I like using the word sympathy. Like there's a particular sympathy for why ants are the way that they are relative to this, and there's a sympathy that like humans cannot be that way because there's a built-in like limiting factor in the way the embodiment of the ants are and what they can do, and human beings physiologically and like in a direct way of the physical and affecting the internal mental emotional space is like, I don't know, linked. I don't have very good words for it, but there's so much there.
Like talking about the memory, how like the post metamorphosis, I don't think he talks about, was it butterflies? What, I forget what animal he uses, but the post metamorphosis can't have memories of the pre metamorphosis because there's no bodily continuity or organizational continuity. Like there's this bodily parallel is necessary for the mental side of things.
I'm not sure that's necessarily true nowadays. Like we've learned about metamorphosis since then, but yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought this was very illustrative of his like what he was getting at. But now that I think about metamorphosis specifically, does Michael Levin have work on that? Because there's got to be something at the electromagnetic level that's happening that might allow like an objection to this
well,
point.
I don't think he's done any work on it. I know people have done work on like metamorphosis, like the details of like the process, and it's not necessarily something that removes memories. He certainly has done the work on flatworms where you can take a single cell from the flatworm, not necessarily from the nervous system of the flatworm, and get a whole new flatworm to regenerate from that one cell, and it has memories of the previous flatworm, which suggests that that each cell is what they call totipotent, which means that it can replicate an entire organism, but also that it carries over a sort of a that memory is encoded somehow, at least what in the flatworm's nervous system or whatever. There's some memories that are encoded, so it could be like, I'm not really sure how the process by which that would happen. I guess that's the problem. I think Michael Levin proposes that there's a bioelectric field that's coordinating a lot of this. So you have like a single cell, it coordinates sort of the architecture of the body, and then it can recapitulate certain behaviors. Some of those can be, innate to the cell or to the genome, but it's also, or it could just be you put it in the same environment and it does the same things, and then you get these memories that form. So there are a lot of qualifications to that, but I mean that's basically his work. Metamorphosis is a process of where different parts of the organism decellularize, but it doesn't mean the whole organism does the same, and so you could probably preserve. And people have done behavioral experiments showing continuity of learning and memory across different phases of life history. That the other side of metamorphosis. There's also, of course, a work going to the ants and humans analogy of E.O. Wilson, and of course, E.O. Wilson made a larger argument about like how ant societies are instructive of human societies, and that there's this sort of biological sort of aspects of, like, if you're thinking about hormones and behavior or things like that. Now, that analogy, it's kind of, at first it's kind of like, wait a minute, now these are two social species. They have, maybe, I don't know if you could argue that insects have culture, but but can you really make those kind of comparisons? So I mean, it's like a lot of E.O. Wilson's ideas are, some are interesting, but some are maybe less, sort of have less support over time as we, I mean, people fight about it a lot, so I'm not going to get into it too much. But so he's like covering a lot of ground here, and there are a lot of things since this book that have like happened that have kind of put these analogies to the test. And the other thing I wonder about, like, I've seen this in other places, is that the sort of approach to learning is all like, people always bring in like this sort of learning, this behavioral learning, and then they bring in development, and they bring in other things like, physiological regulation. And it's kind of interesting. And I don't know if anyone's ever written a review of like breaking down all these views of kind of like learning and adaptation and really giving it a systematic overhaul and saying this, when people talk about learning or plasticity, they're talking about this certain thing, being very specific about the different kinds of, even if they're just kind of analogous, or if they maybe have some relationship mechanistically, just kind of going through and like saying, this is learning and this is, how it works. This is the relationship, say, between like, constructivist learning and like maybe like adaptation, physiological adaptations. So I mean, that's what I was thinking when I was reading this. I'm like, this is all over the place. But I've seen this before in other places, and I've never seen a clarification of a lot of this. Like, really kind of integrating, like saying these are different classes of like adaptive behavior. Whether you want to call it learning or not isn't really the point, because there's a lot of drift between development and learning and adaptation and all this stuff. But really, to have a good, like, almost like you're going through and you're distinguishing between these things and saying, this is clearly better. There's clearly some very tight analogies that you can use, and maybe some that are less analogous given the current state of our knowledge of the area, that maybe we shouldn't use as much, because I mean, you're just kind of throwing in metaphors, and it is really confusing. I mean, it's very seductive in that you can make all these links between things, but it's like, are you talking about the same things? Are they all related?
Yeah, because those topics that you mentioned, like, so I've learning, development, adaptation, and evolution, they're all on different time scales, but maybe so evolution's clearly a different time scale. That one seems to I don't know. Basically, the lines between all of those are blurry because the dynamics at one time scale will impact the processes at all the other time scales.
Yeah, it's time scale, it's mechanism. We talk, I mean, you can say, well, learning is, I mean, there are different types of learning. There are different types, development happens, and it's very distinct from learning a lot of times, but also people will use it almost interchangeably. Sometimes, like they'll say, something is, there's an ontogeny, or, they call it ontogeny sometimes. There's an ontogeny, and it's like learning, and there's developmental learning, and you're acquiring things, sure. But, I mean, there's some distinctions that need to be drawn. I don't know. I think that's something that I've seen a lot of, like, embodied intelligence, and that where they suffer from that kind of, I don't know, maybe analogy creep, like where you're making analogies between systems, and the scale of the analogy sometimes is off for whatever reason. And it's certainly, like, you can make a superficial analogy, but like you get into it, like, if you're going to use it for like further study, it's like, well, these things aren't really the same thing.
Yeah, he kind of gives like 4.5 to 5 pages on just this anatomical, deep biology differences, deep embodiment differences, and he kind of comes out of it here on 57. It looks like, and he talks about like size limits for the ants, and how this affects sort of stored memory as he sees it at that time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's no. Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily. I mean, there's a lot of stuff to like when you make like you do comparatives in like behavior or biology. There's a lot there that can be learned, but like especially like with respect to regulation, you're like, well, if there are two different systems and there are differences and similarities, when we talk about regulation, what are we actually talking about? Are we talking about like a broad analogy? Can I boil that down to like saying this is how it's regulated? Or is it like just a seductive metaphor? And then when I get to the regulation part, I say, well, there's feedback. Right? What's the feedback? Well, it depends. I mean, that's good actually for theory. That's not bad because you don't need to be specific. But sometimes in theories, you can be too general and say, this is always feedback. And you're like, well, maybe, but maybe not. Maybe there's some nuances here we need to take into account. What is feeding back to what? Is it feedback or is it reciprocal behavior? Is it like interactions? We throw those words around a lot, and I don't necessarily know if people appreciate this sort of the specificity you need if you want to move forward with like a cybernetic approach. If you want to say this is something we can do to analyze a system to really make predictions or show if I wanted to model say like human behavior, if I wanted to simulate it, could I use like a model of they use things like swarm intelligence and computer science. Could I really use that to model human behavior? Is it like realistic? Because I'm using basically the system structure of like ant colonies and termite mounds and things like that to model collective human behavior. And people have done that somewhat successfully, although it's a little bit, you show it to like maybe like a sociologist and they'll laugh in your face, but it does have like it does have like a lot of predictive value in a lot of ways. But my point being is that when we think about these broad analogies, we also want to think more about how you might be able to implement something like this to really like get to be something that's close to testable, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
I think Norbert has a little bit interesting commentary about that specifically, in that he kind of he does a little bit of comparative like developmental assessment here about he talks about like puberty for most mammals either represents the end of their epoch of tutelage or as well or beyond it, and how humans have this long sort of puberty adolescence period, and how that affects change and stuff, or the ability to deal with what is a radical changes in the environment. Peter Pan reference. It's already almost the top of the hour. So it feels like this is going by super fast. So trying to gauge. There's like 13 more pages in the chapter. I was a little bit. I'd be curious to kind of get a little more sense of logical type stuff. I didn't quite get what Russell's logical type meant. I don't know how important that is to the main.
Yeah, I also wasn't sure what that meant. I'm okay with doing the second chunk of this book at the next meeting and just delaying chapter 4.
Okay. I think the telephone analogy was sort of
Yeah, that was interesting.
one horse shay.
Oh, I meant to look that up. I have no idea what that means.
I have no idea what a one horse shay is at all.
That's a poem, I guess.
Okay.
But what is it?
I think it's like a carriage.
Maybe.
Is a light two-wheeled carriage
There we go.
Okay.
for two persons, drawn by a single horse. It's kind of like what you could get. You get those like in New York City or Boston to be carried around by those things sometimes. Oh, a back formation from shades. So,
because he also gets into the digital versus analog.
yeah, I wanted to get into that too.
And I thought that the stuff about blood being a signal carrier and like the difference between blood as a signal carrier and neurons as signal carriers, that was interesting. The to whom it may concern messages. Yeah, I think there's a lot that we still should get into. So let's finish next week.
Yeah, there's like a lot. There was so much ground covered in this chapter that I don't really know. I don't even know what to say. I feel like I might just even leave it. There's so many ends to pick up that you know are going to be like 15-minute conversations.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess we'll. Let's say we're gonna. We can start on page 60 next week, and I'm just going to kind of try to pick out some things that I wanted to specifically talk about. What were the things we just said? Digital, analog.
To whom it may concern messages. I included some quotes in the book Notion page.
Okay.
Oh yeah, and the Locke and Pavlov stuff.
Also, like he gets into like if I was gonna make it, and then oh yeah, blood.
Yeah, he has this like engineering-based intuition that blood content concentrations might be like essential for neural dynamics. I thought that was really interesting. I wish he had said more. I got the vibe, but I would like to hear more of his thoughts on that.
He even gets like if I was gonna make like a general artificial intelligence machine, here's how I would do it, and it gets into this deep thing about I'm gonna deal with this criticism in this way, and I'm gonna couch my response to the criticism this way, but I can only do it so much because I don't know what future takes on like resolving learning issues in machines are going to be. And I was like, oh, okay.
So he's a hemodynamicist. Because that's actually like what we're measuring when we use fMRI or FNIR.
Yeah.
Is what, and it's like there's a relationship there in the sense of like ability to cool that area of the brain or whatever. But that's not, I don't know if that's what you meant. Yeah. He's like kind of, yeah, that's what I meant.
I think this is a decent enough quote to paragraph to end on, given everything else. It will often be said there's no theory of learning whatever that will be reasonable for the machine. It will also be said that in the present stage of our knowledge, any theory of learning which I may offer will be premature and will probably not correspond to the actual functioning of the nervous system. I wish to walk a middle path between these two criticisms. On the one hand, I wish to give a method of constructing learning machines, a method which will not only enable me to build certain special machines of this type, but will give me general engineering techniques for construct a very large class of such machines. Only if I reach the degree of generality will I have defended myself in some measure from the criticism that the mechanical process which I claim is similar to learning, is in fact something essentially different, an essentially different nature from learning. On the other hand, I wish to describe such machines in terms which are not too foreign to the actual observables of the nervous system and of human and animal conduct. I'm quite aware I cannot expect to be right in detail in presenting the actual human mechanisms, and I may even be wrong in principle. Nevertheless, if I give a device verbally formulated in terms of this concept belonging to the human mind, human brain, I shall give a point of departure for criticism and a standard to which to compare it on the basis of other theories. I don't really even know.
Some of that is kind of like cognitive science. I mean, like the
Mm-hmm.
trying to apply like a theory of kind of like human learning to machines and vice versa, or at least the mechanism of cognition to like human cognition to understanding it. That theme apparently goes back quite a ways. I mean, before the founding of cognitive science, probably. I mean,
It's
related to cybernetics with information processing.
and that reminds me of basically what I don't know if it was the last thing we said, but I remember specifically Ines Hippolyto talking about that. Like it's whatever the best known technology is right now. Is the analogy for it, and it's sort of like, well, it's almost like this weird sort of projection that we do about, we're going to make an AI or a machine or a robot or Frankenstein that's like human like, and it's like, well, actually it's almost like you can look at it humorous as if like, what's the best projection we could make about ourselves onto this thing that we do understand that actually informs like the current general limits of what we can make. It kind of goes back to, whoa, if you have to be able to create it to some extent. So it is, and to kind of go with, I think, what Amanda's point from last time too, and I'll probably close on this, is basically it's cognitive science kind of debunked as a scientific enterprise. That's not the science. The brain isn't a computer anymore necessarily. So what is it? And they're like, are we kind of in between? What's our best reference point ahead? And are we getting a little bit better at the embodiment process of like, no, it's the brain isn't the brain, or the mind isn't the computer, the mind is a mind, like, I don't know where that goes, but
Go ahead.
To be continued.
I found a collection of papers, and I think the topic was like what are better metaphors for the mind than a computer, and one of the answers, I probably found it through a discussion here, but one of the answers was that the paper was titled something like "The Brain is a Fractal Antenna," and there was a description of what they meant and an argument in favor of that metaphor, and it was very interesting. I want to go back to it because it's relevant to this like resonance idea that has come up a lot.
Yeah, that's a new paper that came out. I actually have it queued up for this week, so that's Saturday's meeting. So we should really get into that. Yeah,
a fractal antenna. Yeah, I don't remember the details, but there were details. It was trying to be like a real explanation of why this fractal antenna idea is an appropriate metaphor. Yeah, definitely related to the resonance stuff and to our like representation discussion, I think, too.
All right. I mean, so I guess we'll kind of pick up from age 60-ish and hit these things next time, hopefully.